Look at a cigarette. Just really look at it for a second. A thin tube of dried leaves wrapped in paper that you set on fire and breathe the smoke from directly into your lungs. If you describe that to someone who had never seen one before, they would think you were describing some kind of punishment. And yet, roughly 1.3 billion people on this planet do exactly this every single day, voluntarily, enthusiastically, sometimes desperately. But here's the question nobody ever thinks to ask. Where did this start? Not the modern cigarette, with its filters and packaging and addiction warnings printed right there on the box, as if that helps. Not the tobacco industry, not the 20th century. Before all of that, before any of that. When did the very first human being look at a burning plant, breathe in the smoke, and think, yes, this, I want more of this? The answer is stranger, older, and more deeply human than you could possibly imagine. It involves shamans, sacred rituals, ancient brain chemistry, a continent-wide secret kept for thousands of years, and a moment of contact between two worlds that changed human behavior on a global scale forever. And the wildest part? Smoking didn't start as a bad habit. It started as a conversation with the gods.
To understand where smoking started, we need to go back, way back. Not just a few hundred years, not just 1,000 years. We're talking about a timeline so long it makes recorded history look like a footnote. The relationship between humans and smoke is genuinely ancient, and it didn't begin with tobacco. It began with fire. When early Homo sapiens first learned to control fire, somewhere between 400,000 and 1 million years ago, they didn't just get warmth and light and cooked food. They got smoke, constant, unavoidable, swirling smoke. And something interesting happened. When you sit around a fire, burning certain plants, certain woods, certain resins, the smoke isn't just smoke. It contains chemical compounds that affect the human brain. Some of these compounds are mildly psychoactive. They alter mood. They reduce anxiety. They create a subtle but real shift in consciousness. Ancient humans sitting around fires every single night for hundreds of thousands of years were being gently chemically influenced by the plants they were burning. And at some point, someone noticed. Someone realized that certain plants, when burned, did something to the mind. Something that felt significant. Something that felt powerful. Something that felt in the framework of an ancient worldview that had no concept of brain chemistry or pharmacology, like something supernatural was happening. This is where the story gets genuinely fascinating, because the first deliberate smoking in human history wasn't recreational. It wasn't social. It wasn't even remotely about pleasure or habit or addiction. It was religious. Across virtually every ancient culture that developed smoking independently, the practice began as a sacred ritual, a spiritual technology, a method of communication between the human world and something beyond it. In ancient Mesopotamia, priests burned aromatic plants and resins in elaborate ceremonies, the smoke rising upward, understood as a literal physical message being carried to the gods. The word perfume itself comes from the Latin perfumum, meaning through smoke. The entire concept of pleasant scent was originally inseparable from the concept of sacred smoke. In ancient Egypt, temples burned incense constantly, not for the smell, for the connection. The smoke was the medium through which humans spoke to the divine. In ancient China, shamans burned specific herbs and inhaled the smoke deliberately as part of healing ceremonies, understanding on some level that certain plants, when burned, created altered states that allowed access to spiritual knowledge. The pattern repeats across cultures so separated by distance and time that they could not possibly have learned it from each other, which means they discovered it independently, which means something about burning plants and inhaling smoke is so fundamentally connected to human spiritual experience that multiple civilizations arrived at the same conclusion from scratch. But tobacco specifically, the plant most associated with smoking today, where did that begin? The answer is the Americas, and the timeline will genuinely surprise you. Archaeological evidence suggests that humans in the Americas were using tobacco at least 12,300 years ago. We know this because in 2021, researchers excavating a site in Utah found ancient tobacco seeds alongside human artifacts at a level corresponding to approximately 12,300 years before the present. That is not a typo. 12,300 years ago. Agriculture itself is only about 10,000 years old, which means humans were using tobacco before they had even figured out farming, before they had permanent settlements, before they had writing, or cities, or wheels, or any of the things we associate with civilization. A hunter-gatherer, walking across an ancient landscape, carrying nothing but the most essential tools for survival, still found space in that life for tobacco. That is how deeply embedded this plant became in human culture. That is how significant the relationship was from the very very beginning. Now here is something that completely reframes how you think about ancient smoking. The indigenous peoples of the Americas who used tobacco did not smoke it the way a person today smokes a cigarette during a coffee break. The context was completely different. Tobacco was sacred, genuinely, profoundly, ceremonially sacred. Among many Native American cultures, tobacco was understood as a gift from the spirit world. It was used in ceremonies, marking births, deaths, alliances between tribes, prayers before hunts, healing rituals, and diplomatic negotiations. When two tribal leaders wanted to establish peace or form an alliance, they shared tobacco together. This is where the concept of the peace pipe comes from. It was not a casual social gesture. It was a binding spiritual contract. The smoke was the witness. The smoke was the seal. Tobacco was also used by shamans, the spiritual leaders and healers of these cultures, specifically to induce altered states of consciousness that they believed allowed them to travel to other realms, communicate with spirits, and access healing knowledge unavailable to ordinary waking consciousness. And here's the thing about that belief. It is not as mystically baseless as a modern scientific worldview might assume. Tobacco contains nicotine. Nicotine is one of the most powerfully psychoactive substances found in any plant. In large quantities, far larger than those found in modern cigarettes, nicotine produces genuine hallucinogenic effects. Shamans using concentrated tobacco in ritual contexts were experiencing real altered states of consciousness. The spiritual technology worked. It just worked through neurochemistry rather than divine intervention. For thousands of years, this knowledge stayed in the Americas. The rest of the world had no idea tobacco existed. Europe, Asia, Africa, the Middle East, all of human civilization outside the Americas went through its entire ancient and medieval history without ever encountering this plant. The Roman Empire rose and fell with no knowledge of tobacco. The ancient Greeks built the foundations of Western philosophy without ever smoking. The great dynasties of China, the Islamic Golden Age, the entire medieval period in Europe, all of it tobacco-free. And then, in 1492, everything changed. Christopher Columbus landed in the Americas, and within days was offered dried tobacco leaves by the Taino people he encountered. His sailors watched the indigenous people rolling tobacco into leaves and smoking it. They tried it, and they immediately understood they had found something remarkable. When Columbus's sailors returned to Europe, they brought tobacco with them, and what happened next was one of the fastest viral spreads of any behavior in human history. Within decades, tobacco had spread across Europe. Within a century, it had reached Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Within 2 centuries, it was being grown on every inhabited continent. A plant that had been kept in the Americas for 12,000 years spread across the entire globe in less than 200 years. No social media, no advertising, no global communication network, just sailors, traders, and the overwhelmingly powerful effect of nicotine on the human brain. Here's the part of the story that puts everything into perspective. When tobacco arrived in Europe, nobody understood what it actually was or what it was actually doing to the human body. Early European smokers thought tobacco was medicine. Genuinely, sincerely, medically prescribed medicine. Physicians in the 16th and 17th centuries recommended tobacco as a treatment for headaches, toothaches, arthritis, bad breath, yes, bad breath, plague, cancer, and almost every other ailment you can think of. King James I of England wrote an entire treatise against tobacco in 1604, calling it harmful to the brain and dangerous to the lungs. And he was completely right. But almost nobody listened because by that point, the addiction had already taken hold across the population. The brain chemistry of nicotine addiction is brutally effective. Nicotine triggers the release of dopamine in the brain's reward system with a speed and reliability that very few other substances can match. Within seconds of inhaling, the brain receives a signal that whatever just happened was good and should happen again. The ancient shamans who used tobacco in sacred rituals were right that it was powerful. They were just wrong about why. So here's the full picture. Somewhere between 12 and 50,000 years ago, a human being in the Americas first deliberately burned tobacco and breathed in its smoke. They experienced something that felt transcendent and sacred and profound because their brain was flooded with neurochemical signals it had never encountered before. That experience became a ritual. The ritual became a culture. The culture kept the secret for thousands of years. Then in 1492, the secret got out, and the human brain, the same brain that had been chemically vulnerable to nicotine since before civilization began, did exactly what ancient brain chemistry always does when it encounters something that triggers its reward system. It wanted more. The shamans talked to the gods. We built an entire global industry around the neurochemical echo of that conversation. And somewhere between between the sacred fire and the convenience store cigarette display, something genuinely profound got lost in translation. Every cigarette ever smoked is a chemical memory of the very first fire, of the very first human who sat in the smoke and felt something shift in their mind and decided that whatever that was, it mattered. 12,000 years later, 1.3 billion people apparently agree.